legendary warriors, one sacred city, the fate of Jerusalem hanging in the balance. In 1191, Richard the Lionheart, King of England, crossed swords with Saladin, Sultan of Egypt and Syria, in a clash that would define the Third Crusade and echo through 8 centuries of history. This wasn't just a battle between Christianity and Islam. It was a collision of 2 military geniuses, 2 codes of honor, and 2 visions for the Holy Land. Blood was shed, empires trembled, and in the end, neither man would claim total victory. This is the story of the greatest rivalry of the medieval world. Before we dive into this epic tale, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our deep dives into history's greatest conflicts. And drop a comment below, Team Richard or Team Saladin. Let's see where you stand. The year is 1187. Jerusalem, the most sacred city in Christendom, has fallen. For 88 years, Christian crusaders held the holy city. But on October 2nd, Saladin's Muslim forces recaptured it in a stunning military campaign. The news shattered Europe. Pope Gregory VIII died from the shock. His successor, Pope Clement III, immediately called for a new crusade, the Third Crusade, to reclaim Jerusalem at any cost. 3 of Europe's most powerful monarchs answered the call: Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire, Philip II of France, and Richard I of England. But fate had other plans. Frederick drowned crossing a river in Anatolia, his army scattered. Philip would eventually abandon the crusade after petty disputes with Richard. That left one man standing against Saladin, Richard the Lionheart, and he would prove to be Saladin's most formidable opponent yet. What followed was a 2-year campaign of sieges, pitched battles, and psychological warfare that pushed both leaders to their absolute limits. Richard brought revolutionary military tactics and unmatched battlefield courage. Saladin countered with strategic brilliance and a united Muslim coalition. Their conflict would produce some of the medieval world's bloodiest battles and, surprisingly, moments of mutual respect that transcended the religious divide. This is the complete story of their legendary confrontation. The strategies, the battles, the betrayals, and the legacy that still resonates today. To understand this conflict, we must first understand what led to this moment. The Crusades began in 1095 when Pope Urban II called for the liberation of Jerusalem from Muslim control. The First Crusade succeeded beyond anyone's wildest expectations, establishing Christian kingdoms across the Levant. For nearly a century, these Crusader states maintained a precarious existence, caught between internal divisions and external Muslim threats. But in the mid-12th century, everything changed. A Kurdish warrior named Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known in the West as Saladin, rose to power. He wasn't just another warlord. Saladin was a visionary who understood that the Crusaders could only be defeated if the Muslim world united. He spent years consolidating power, conquering Syria, unifying Egypt, and bringing disparate Muslim factions under his banner. By 1187, he commanded the largest unified Muslim army the Crusaders had ever faced. The Crusader states, meanwhile, were fracturing from within. King Guy of Jerusalem was weak and indecisive. His kingdom was plagued by infighting between rival factions, the Templars, the Hospitallers, and various noble houses, all pursuing their own agendas. Reynald of Chatillon, a reckless Crusader lord, repeatedly broke treaties with Saladin by attacking Muslim caravans and pilgrims. These provocations gave Saladin the justification he needed. On July 4th, 1187, at the Horns of Hattin, Saladin destroyed the Crusader army in one of medieval history's most decisive battles. He captured King Guy, executed Reynald personally, and opened the road to Jerusalem. 3 months later, the Holy City was his. The Christian world was in shock. The age of Crusader dominance was over, or so it seemed. Richard III was born, September 8th, 1157, the third son of Henry II of England and Eleanor of Aquitaine. He wasn't supposed to be king, but the death of his older brothers changed his destiny. Richard grew up in his mother's court in Aquitaine, learning the arts of war and chivalry. By his teens, he was already commanding armies and earning a fearsome reputation. He was tall, with reddish-blonde hair, immensely strong, and possessed a warrior's charisma that inspired fanatic loyalty in his troops. But Richard was more than just a brave knight. He was a military innovator who understood siege warfare, logistics, and the importance of naval power. He was also ruthless when necessary. He had no qualms about executing prisoners or razing towns that opposed him. His nickname, Coeur de Lion or Lionheart, reflected both his courage and his ferocity. When he took the cross in 1187, he wasn't seeking glory alone. He genuinely believed God had chosen him to reclaim Jerusalem. Saladin was born in 1137 in Tikrit in modern-day Iraq. Unlike Richard, who inherited wealth and power, Saladin earned everything through merit. He rose through the ranks, serving various Muslim rulers, displaying both military brilliance and political acumen. By 1174, he had become Sultan of Egypt and Syria, founding the Ayyubid dynasty. He was slightly built, with a dark beard and penetrating eyes that chroniclers described as both kind and fierce. What set Saladin apart wasn't just his military skills, but his character. He was known throughout the Muslim and Christian worlds for his mercy, justice, and devotion to Islam. When he recaptured Jerusalem, he spared the Christian population, a stark contrast to the massacre that occurred when Crusaders first took the city in 1099. He treated prisoners humanely, often releasing them for modest ransoms or even for free. Even his enemies admired him. Saladin combined the qualities of a warrior, statesman, and spiritual leader in a way that made him uniquely dangerous. These two men, Richard, the embodiment of Western chivalry, and Saladin, the champion of Islam, were about to collide in a conflict that would test everything they believed in. Richard arrived in the Holy Land in June 1191. The siege of Acre was already in its second year, a brutal, grinding affair that had claimed thousands of lives on both sides. The Crusaders had the city surrounded, but Saladin's army surrounded the Crusaders, creating a double siege that threatened to end in Christian disaster. The situation was desperate. Disease ravaged the camps, food was scarce, morale was collapsing. Richard's arrival changed everything. He brought fresh troops, siege equipment, and something the Crusaders had lacked: decisive leadership. Within days of his arrival, Richard revolutionized the siege operations. He deployed massive trebuchets and mangonels that could hurl 300-pound stones at Acre's walls. He organized systematic assaults on weak points in the defenses. He personally led attacks, often fighting in the front ranks, which electrified his troops. But Richard also fell seriously ill during the siege, possibly with scurvy or arnaldia, a disease that caused hair and nails to fall out. Even from his sickbed he directed operations, having himself carried to the walls on a litter so he could continue commanding the assault. This dedication inspired his men to superhuman efforts. The defenders of Acre, meanwhile, fought with desperation, knowing Saladin's relief attempts had repeatedly failed to break the siege. On July 12, 1191, after one final massive bombardment, Acre's garrison surrendered. The city's fall was a catastrophic blow to Saladin. He had invested enormous resources trying to save Acre, and its loss gave the Crusaders a vital foothold. The terms of surrender included the return of the true cross, allegedly the cross Jesus was crucified on, 2,700 Christian prisoners, and a ransom of 200,000 gold dinars. But here's where Richard's ruthlessness emerged. When Saladin delayed delivering the first installment of the ransom and the prisoners, Richard made a horrific decision. On August 20th, he ordered the execution of 2,700 Muslim prisoners in full view of Saladin's army. Men, women, and children were marched out and slaughtered. It was psychological warfare designed to intimidate Saladin and demonstrate that Richard wouldn't tolerate delays or broken agreements. The massacre shocked both Christians and Muslims, but it achieved Richard's goal. It showed Saladin he was dealing with an enemy who would do whatever was necessary to win. If you're learning something new about this epic historical rivalry, show your support by giving this video a like. It really helps us continue creating in-depth historical content. And check out our community tab for exclusive polls about wars in history. Your input helps shape future videos. With Acre secured, Richard faced a strategic dilemma. Jerusalem was 60 miles inland through hostile territory. To reach it, he needed a secure supply line, which meant taking the coastal cities first. In late August 1191, Richard marched his army south along the coast toward Jaffa, with his fleet paralleling the march offshore to provide supplies and protection. Saladin knew this march was his opportunity. If he could destroy Richard's army in the field, the Third Crusade would collapse. He shadowed the Crusader column with his mobile cavalry, launching constant hit-and-run attacks designed to provoke Richard into breaking formation. Muslim archers on swift horses would gallop in, fire volleys of arrows, and retreat before the Crusaders could respond. It was exhausting, demoralizing warfare that slowly wore down Richard's forces. Richard, however, was a tactical genius. He organized his army into a tight defensive column with infantry on the outside and cavalry protected in the center. The foot soldiers held large shields that created a mobile fortress. He gave strict orders. No matter what provocation Saladin offered, no one was to break formation without his command. For days, the Crusaders marched under constant harassment, discipline holding by sheer force of will. On September 7, 1191, near the town of Arsuf, Saladin decided to force the issue. He committed his entire army to a massive assault, sending wave after wave of mounted warriors against the Crusader column. The pressure was immense. Knights begged Richard for permission to counterattack. Men were falling to arrows. The Hospitaller Knights on the rear guard, bearing the brunt of the assault, sent desperate messages, saying they couldn't hold much longer. Richard waited and waited. He needed the perfect moment. Then, just as Saladin's forces fully committed to their assault, Richard unleashed his heavy cavalry in a devastating countercharge. The Frankish knights, encased in chain mail and plate armor atop massive war horses, smashed into Saladin's lighter cavalry with the force of a hammer blow. The Muslim lines shattered. Saladin's army, which had never expected such discipline from the Crusaders, broke and fled. The Battle of Arsuf was Richard's masterpiece. He had inflicted a major defeat on Saladin while preserving his own army's strength. More importantly, he had proven that Saladin's forces could be beaten in open combat. The psychological impact was enormous. Richard's reputation soared, while Saladin's aura of invincibility cracked. The road to Jerusalem seemed open. After Arsuf, Richard continued south, capturing Jaffa and securing the entire coastal region. By January 1192, he turned inland toward Jerusalem, the ultimate prize. His army marched to within 12 miles of the holy city. Jerusalem's walls were visible in the distance. After 5 years of planning and 6 months of campaigning, Richard's goal was almost within reach. But then Richard did something unexpected. He turned back. His decision shocked his army and puzzled historians for centuries. Why would the Lionheart, having come so close, retreat from Jerusalem? The answer lies in military reality versus emotional desire. Richard's council of war, including the military orders and experienced crusaders, laid out the brutal truth. Even if they took Jerusalem, they couldn't hold it. Jerusalem was far inland, with vulnerable supply lines. Saladin still commanded a substantial army in the surrounding countryside. If Richard besieged Jerusalem, Saladin would cut his supply routes, and the Crusader army would be trapped and starved. Even if the city fell, the Crusaders would face constant siege from Muslim forces. The Crusader states lacked the manpower to garrison Jerusalem permanently while defending the coastal regions. It was a strategic nightmare. Richard faced another problem. His European allies were unreliable. Philip of France had already gone home and was scheming to seize Richard's lands. Richard's brother John was plotting to usurp his throne. The longer Richard stayed in the Holy Land, the more his kingdom back home was at risk. He needed to return to England, but he couldn't leave without securing the Crusader state's future. So, Richard made the hardest decision of his military career. Instead of a glorious but ultimately doomed assault on Jerusalem, he would focus on securing what the Crusaders could actually hold, the coastal cities that ensured access to the Holy Land. It was the rational choice, but it broke the hearts of his men. Some wept openly. Others accused Richard of cowardice, which was absurd given his battlefield record. But Richard understood that being a great general sometimes meant making unpopular decisions. While Richard made war, he also pursued peace. Throughout 1191 and 1192, he engaged in on-and-off negotiations with Saladin. The discussions were complex, sometimes serious, sometimes theatrical, but always fascinating. Richard proposed multiple solutions. Perhaps his sister Joanna could marry Saladin's brother Al-Adil, with the couple ruling Jerusalem jointly. Perhaps the kingdom of Jerusalem could be split, with Christians controlling the coast and Muslims the interior. Saladin entertained these proposals, but never seriously considered accepting them. Jerusalem was too important to Islam. He had recaptured the noble sanctuary, site of the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque. To surrender it again, even partially, would be unthinkable to the Muslim world. But Saladin respected Richard enough to negotiate in good faith, and the talks did serve a purpose. They gave both sides time to rest and regroup. The negotiations also produced one of history's most fascinating relationships. Richard and Saladin never met face to face, but they developed a mutual respect bordering on admiration. They exchanged gifts, horses, falcons, precious fruits. When Richard fell seriously ill again, Saladin sent his personal physician and fresh fruit to aid his recovery. When Saladin's horse was killed in battle, Richard sent him 2 replacement horses. These weren't just diplomatic gestures. They reflected genuine respect between warriors. In June 1192, Richard made one last attempt to take Jerusalem. He marched to Beit Nuba, again within sight of the city. Again, his military council advised against assault. Again, Richard retreated. This second withdrawal devastated his army's morale. Many Crusaders accused Richard of betrayal, refusing to understand the strategic logic. The French contingent practically mutinied. Richard's political position was becoming untenable. Then came news that changed everything. Saladin had attacked Jaffa and taken the city. Richard's coastal strategy was collapsing. He needed to act fast. Despite being outnumbered and still recovering from illness, Richard rushed to Jaffa with a small force. In one of his most legendary exploits, he arrived by ship, jumped into the surf in full armor, and led an amphibious assault that retook the city in a single day. Days later, Saladin launched a surprise dawn attack on Richard's camp. With only 55 knights and a few hundred infantry, Richard personally led a defensive stand so impressive that Saladin's commanders refused to continue the assault out of sheer respect for Richard's courage. By September 1192, both Richard and Saladin were exhausted. Richard's kingdom demanded his return. Saladin's empire was financially drained from years of warfare. On September 2nd, 1192, they signed the Treaty of Jaffa. The agreement reflected the military stalemate. The Crusaders kept the coastal strip from Tyre to Jaffa. Jerusalem remained under Muslim control, but Christian pilgrims received guaranteed safe passage to visit the holy sites. It was a compromise neither side wanted, but both sides needed. Richard left the Holy Land on October 9, 1192, never having entered Jerusalem as a conqueror. His journey home became its own adventure, captured by Duke Leopold of Austria, held for ransom by Emperor Henry VI, finally returning to England in 1194. He spent his remaining years fighting to reclaim his French territories, dying from a crossbow wound in 1199 at age 41. He never returned to the Holy Land. Saladin outlived Richard by less than 4 years. The strain of constant warfare and administration had broken his health. He died on March 4, 1193, in Damascus, at age 55. At his death, he had almost nothing. His personal funds had been entirely spent on charity and his military campaigns. He was buried in a simple tomb next to the Umayyad Mosque, and when his possessions were inventoried, they found he owned only 1 gold coin and 40 pieces of silver. He had given everything to the cause of Islam. So who won their legendary confrontation? The answer is nobody completely. Militarily, Richard won more battles and captured more territory. Strategically, Saladin kept Jerusalem and preserved Muslim control of the interior. Politically, both men achieved partial success. The Crusader states survived for another century, but never again threatened Jerusalem. The Third Crusade didn't achieve its ultimate goal, but it prevented the total collapse of the Crusader presence in the Holy Land. But the true legacy of their conflict transcends military outcomes. Richard and Saladin came to represent the ideals of their respective cultures. Richard as the embodiment of Western chivalry and martial prowess, Saladin as the model of Muslim nobility and justice. Their mutual respect, maintained even while trying to kill each other, demonstrated that honor could exist even in holy war. Medieval chroniclers, both Christian and Muslim, celebrated both men's achievements. The confrontation between Richard the Lionheart and Saladin represents one of history's greatest military rivalries. For 2 years, they matched wits and weapons across the Holy Land, producing battles and sieges that still captivate us today. Richard brought revolutionary tactics and unstoppable courage. Saladin countered with strategic patience and unified Muslim resistance. Neither could definitively defeat the other because they were too evenly matched, each compensating for their weaknesses with different strengths. What makes their story endure isn't just the military drama, but the humanity underneath. These weren't cardboard villains or simplistic heroes. Richard could be cruel, executing prisoners without mercy, yet also magnanimous, respecting his enemies. Saladin could be ruthless in war, yet famous for his mercy in victory. They were complex men navigating impossible situations, trying to balance religious conviction with political reality, honor with pragmatism. The Crusades continued for another century after their deaths, but the Richard-Saladin confrontation remained its defining moment, the point where two civilizations met not just in battle, but in mutual recognition. When we strip away the religious rhetoric and propaganda, we find two brilliant military minds, each trying to serve their God and their people, locked in a conflict neither could truly win. Their story reminds us that even enemies can respect each other, that war can be conducted with honor, and that history's greatest battles are often fought between warriors who might, in different circumstances, have been friends. That's the paradox at the heart of the Third Crusade. The man Richard most admired was the man he spent 2 years trying to destroy. And Saladin, who fought to drive Christians from the Holy Land, respected Richard more than most of his Muslim allies. Their war was terrible, brutal, and ultimately inconclusive. But it was also, in its own tragic way, magnificent. Thank you for watching this deep dive into one of history's greatest rivalries. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and hit the notification bell for more epic historical content every week. Let me know in the comments, what other legendary historical confrontations would you like us to cover? Until next time, remember, history isn't just dates and facts. It's human drama on the grandest scale.